That's right. Thanks, Count Corley. Minister, the government are seeking to dazzle and fool people with once-off measures. But the reality is that poverty, deprivation, financial hardship, inequality are not once-off phenomena. They are systemic, and once-off measures will simply not cut it. And despite the attempts to dazzle people with these once-off measures, the net fact, when you look closely at this budget, is that taking into account the cost of living hikes, the rises in inflation, the increasing rents, ordinary workers will be worse off after this budget. People on disability, pensioners, people dependent on social welfare payments will all be worse off at the end of this budget than they were before it. But of course, the corporations, the energy companies, the banks, the property speculators are enjoying a bonanza in profits, and we have seen a shocking and ever-growing concentration of wealth at the top of our society being enjoyed by corporations and super wealthy individuals, and the gap between the very richest in our society and ordinary working people who are being hammered with the cost of living and affordable and the housing crisis getting ever wider. I mean, you look at the enormous budget surpluses available to the government, and you look at the extraordinary increases in profits that corporations have seen. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world going into this budget, and you have the resources to eliminate poverty and to genuinely protect people with disabilities, our pensioners and the vulnerable. But what have you given them? A miserable €12 a week. Not even close to compensating for the cost of living hikes that people have suffered over the last year. Let's put this clearly in context. To be at risk of poverty, you have to be earning about 60%, your income is about 60% of the median income. That means to be above the poverty line, you need €318 a week. And what the government is giving people is a miserable €12 on top of €218 a week for the basic social welfare payment or disability payment, and for pensioners, €12 on top of the €265 they get, leaving the overwhelming majority of our pensioners, of people on disability, of the most vulnerable people in our society living in poverty, when we have unprecedented resources available to the government where you could have, at a stroke, eliminated poverty. We will leave huge, hundreds of thousands of our citizens existing still in poverty, crushed with the cost of living increase. The failure to particularly provide for those with disabilities and the additional costs of those with disabilities is utterly shameful. We had a cost of disability report that shows that people with disabilities incur additional costs of between €9,000 and €12,000 a year. And what have we given them? Nothing, effectively. Nothing. A once-off payment of €400 doesn't even go next to near compensating for the additional costs that people with disabilities have to endure. We could have and should have given at least an additional €50 a week to those with disability. And let's remember, during COVID, when we introduced the COVID pandemic payment, we set as a baseline for people who are put on that payment €350. And that is what disability activists and campaigners have been saying should be the benchmark. For those with disabilities, you could argue indeed for everybody, but at least to give social welfare increases that keep people above the poverty line and genuinely account for the additional costs that people with disabilities have to suffer. Workers. Again, government trying to dazzle people with USC reductions, minor reductions in USC, changes in bans and thresholds, but the government's own budget documentation makes clear that workers will be worse off. Inflation running at 5%. The Consumer Price Index shows actually 6.7% increase in the cost of living with the Consumer Price Index over the last 12 months up to August. What are workers getting? For anybody who wants the reference, page 16 of tax policy changes. Somebody on €25,000 will get 1.1% extra. Somebody on 30,000, 1.1% extra. 35,000, 1.1% extra. 40,000, 1%. 45,000, 2.2%. 55,000, 2%, and similar across the board. So ordinary, low, average, modest income working people will only get a 1 to 2% increase in their income against a background of at least 5% inflation. That's a pay cut. In reality, it's a pay cut. A significant pay cut on top of the pay cuts in real terms that workers suffered in the year previous. So that's the truth. For all the smoke and mirrors of supposed tax changes, once-off payments, and so on, workers end up worse off. The energy credits. I mean, let's just put this in context. Last year, there were 3 €200 energy credits. The consequence of that, as we discovered with the figures that came out recently, is currently, before the winter months start, there are 250,000 people in arrears for their electricity. There are 1 in 4 people in arrears for their gas bills, and that's for the summer months, before people have to seriously turn on the heating to stop themselves freezing heading into the winter, and the government is going to give them less this year than they gave them last year. Last year wasn't enough to stop hundreds of thousands of people ending up in arrears. This year is less. So more people going to suffer fuel poverty, more people afraid to turn on the hot water, afraid to have a hot shower, afraid to turn on the heating as we head into the winter months. But do we do anything about the profiteering of the energy companies? Not at all. ESB, in the first 6 months of this year, earned more profits than they did in the entire year in 2021. Absolutely unbelievable. Doubling their profits in the course of 2 years to over 670 million profits in just 6 months. In the first 6 months of this year, profiting off the energy misery of working people, of pensioners, of people with disabilities, and people on low incomes, now already in arrears and facing into the winter months where it is really quite scary what people might face into. And then, of course, there's the issue of housing. And here, this budget is just a shocking, unbelievable failure. The government have done nothing above and beyond the Housing for All plan, which is failing and failing catastrophically. We have record numbers of people homeless. We have, to give an example of my area, the Housing for All, as I have explained, ad nauseum in this House. The Housing for All targets in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, which will probably not even be met, even if they were met, will result in more people being on the housing lists at the end of Housing for All than are currently on the housing list. That's even if the targets are met. And that's against a background where in my area you will be waiting a minimum of 12 to 15 and sometimes 20 years for a council house if you put yourself on the list. And at the end of Housing for All, currently, if we stick to the current plan that is failing so badly, there will be more people on the housing list in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown in 5 years' time than there are now, because your plan fails to take into account the number of additional people coming on the list who cannot afford the absolutely shocking rents and shocking house prices, which are completely unaffordable for the vast majority of working people. So more and more people forced to go on housing lists, but the plans to build social and affordable housing woefully, shockingly inadequate. So in terms of the capital investment, to use the jargon of the budget, the capital investment, a marginal increase from 2.3 to 2.5 billion for housing, but that will only take into account the cost increases. So there'll be nothing extra. There'll be nothing extra, and there is no change to the targets for social and affordable housing. Now, I cannot understand how, when we have record budget surpluses and we have billions in corporate tax revenues, windfall revenues, why the government does not see it as a good idea to use those billions to build more social and affordable houses, to acquire more houses for social and affordable housing, and to use that to invest in refurbishing the tens of thousands of vacant and derelict houses across the country. I cannot understand it. I mean, the government puts out this mantra, oh, we shouldn't be using that money for ongoing current expenditure where we can't rely on it in the future. Now, even if I accept that argument, and there's some merit to that argument does not apply to dealing with the housing crisis. Because if you don't build the social and affordable housing with the money we have, you end up spending more on current expenditure, HAPs, RAS and leasing, and that is much more of a fiscal problem in the future than using the money available now to buy, build, acquire and refurbish public housing, which will save us money. Not only will it help resolve the housing misery that people are facing who are out there trying to find accommodation they can afford, which is like looking for a needle in a haystack for the vast majority of people and driving so many of them into homelessness. But if you use that money now to build, buy, acquire, refurbish social and affordable housing, it will actually save the state billions in the future. It'll put us in a more sustainable financial position in the future than this crazy reliance on HAPs, RAS and leasing. But even there, even though the government is obsessed with that model of relying on the private landlords, pouring hundreds and hundreds of millions additional every year, now up to nearly €1 billion in current expenditure going to landlords, even in that completely misguided system, you don't even raise the flippin' HAP thresholds in line with the rent increases. Right? If you're going to persist with this ridiculous way of trying to address the housing crisis, the very least you should do is ensure that the HAP thresholds are sufficient for people who are looking for somewhere, looking for a HAP tenancy, to be able to find somewhere that's within the thresholds. But they can't. I mean, the homeless HAP threshold in my area for a family, the highest one you can get is €1,900. You go on daft.ie or myhome.ie and try to find a one-bedroom for €1,900, you won't find it. You definitely won't find a two-bedroom. And when you're talking about 3 or 4 bedroom, you'll be over €3,000 a month. The thresholds are nowhere near. It is an exercise in futility and despair to be told to find a HAP tenancy with the level of rents in most of Dublin, my area, and many of the urban centres. And then, of course, there's another group of people who aren't even eligible for social housing because they're over the thresholds. But there's not enough cost rental because the amount of cost rental you've delivered is pathetic. You're not willing to raise the targets on it. So there is now an increasing number of working people who find themselves looking for rented accommodation and they're not even entitled to HAP. They're not entitled to rent support. And if they're older, they won't get a local authority home loan or any bank loan to buy a house because they're too old. So increasingly we were having working people who've worked all their lives, often hitting their late 50s and 60s, threatened with or actually driven into homelessness because there is no support for them, nothing offered for them. And that problem is going to grow and grow unless the government deal with it. How am I doing for time? Sorry. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Right. A couple of more brief points I just want to make. Oh yeah, here's something that hasn't been mentioned. In all of this failed housing policy by the government, one interesting little, because I'm a real nerd, I read the fine print of the Book of Estimates, there is an additional 44% increase in expenditure for consultancy. So the amount paid to consultants to dream up the housing plans that have left us with the worst housing and homelessness crisis in the history of the state has gone up from, listen to this, 117 million last year, a shocking figure in itself, to 169 million. A 52 million increase in money going to consultants to dream up the housing policies that have left us with this housing crisis. You could not make it up. And in terms of the renters' credit, incredibly, €250 additional for the renters' credit, less than the government have given the landlords. So next year, the landlords are going to get €600 in a tax credit, the year after €800, and the year after that €1,000, all based on a spurious claim that landlords are exiting the market when the CSO has shown actually we have more tenancies than we had in the past, and that in fact all that's really happening with the sale of these properties is one landlord, usually bigger landlords, buying off the small landlords, but the number of actual rental properties increasing. So we don't have a problem of not enough landlords. What we have is a problem of landlords charging extortionate rents, making extortionate profits, but the government want to give them tax breaks. As well as, of course, for the really big property investors who are already getting tax breaks on REITs and so on, who are getting tax breaks on rental revenue and capital gains. The mortgage interest relief is a joke. I'll just give you one example. Lola, a working single mother, last year, 7,000 additional last year in interest repayments. And she's going to get 1,250 back. How could anybody sustain €7,000 in additional interest payments? That's what's happening. Tens of thousands of people on tracker and variable mortgages being absolutely crucified by banks that are making shocking profits, and that's the best you can do for them. But again, no action on the profiteering of the banks, despite our repeated requests that you would do so. There's other things, of course, we aren't mentioned in the budget, but will be coming in soon, by the way. The carbon tax increases, which will come in the next couple of months, essentially undermining in terms of diesel and fuel, and then other carbon tax increases next year, which will effectively neutralise any of the one-off measures that the government have given in that area. The final point I want to make is all of this happens against a background of absolutely extraordinary increases in profits. And this is the thing that's never ever talked about. From 77 million in 77 billion in pre-tax profits in 2012 up to 2021, latest available figures, 25 billion profits. And although we don't have a figure from the government for 2022, we know that the corporate tax revenue has jumped to an incredible 24 billion, extrapolating from previous years. That means we are well over 300 billion now in pre-tax profits for the corporations. Enormous increases in their profits. That they are the winners, and the government protect them, and in fact they've given them an additional tax break to compensate them for the 15%, the increase to 15% in the nominal corporate tax rate. They've given them another big loophole so they won't really pay any additional tax, which by changing the research and development tax credit, currently worth 750 million a year, all going to those same super profitable corporations, and they've increased the R&D tax credit from 25% to 30%. Tens of millions to go with extra money to companies already enjoying obscene, staggering profits, while ordinary people are being crushed with the cost of living and a housing crisis. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised from this government.
Thanks, Ciarán Comhairle. What sums up this budget is permanent tax breaks for the rich and once-off crumbs for ordinary people. If you're an angel investor, I think many people won't have heard that term before today, but they'll wake up tomorrow and they'll discover that there's a new tax break. So if you're an angel investor, it's a great budget because there's a new tax break worth almost €500,000. It's a great budget. For the landlords who get a new tax break, it's a great budget. For the tax-avoiding big corporations, it's a great budget. But for ordinary people who get inadequate, once-off measures, this is a very, very poor budget. It used to be that there was one once-off measure, really, which was the annual Christmas bonus in terms of social protection payments, and that was it. Now we have a whole range of once-off measures, which mean that the core rates of payment are slipping, bringing people further and further into poverty. The government is kind of papering over what is happening of the deepening deprivation of ordinary people, those who are reliant on fixed income, be they pensioners, people with disabilities, or unemployed people. But the problem is that poverty is not once-off, deprivation is not once-off, inequality is not once-off, the housing crisis is not once-off, the health crisis is not once-off. None of those things go away. All of those are permanent unless we have a government that actually addresses them. And I think the measure that sums up the government best, or the budget best, is the treatment of landlords versus the treatment of renters. If you're a landlord, you're getting a tax break for next year worth €600. The following year, it's €800. The year after that, and then onwards, is €1,000. Compared to what a renter gets in this budget, €250. So the landlord gets almost 3 times as much as the renter, and of course, much of what the renter gets, in actual fact, is going to end up in the pocket of the landlord. And the justification for this, in a context when we have record rents, that is money that is going into the pockets of landlords, from the minister, he says, for every tenant, there has to be a landlord. Complete nonsense. Sure, why can't the state be the landlord of any tenant who is currently in a home where the landlord says they want to get out of the market? Fine, get out of the market. The state should buy at market rate. The tenant gets secure tenure, the state gets an asset, the landlord gets to leave. This idea that we have to incentivize landlords to stay in the market, it's like saying we should give a tax break to ticket touts to encourage the live music industry. Landlords do not provide housing, they simply rent out existing housing. If they leave the market, it is not a problem as long as the state steps in and buys it and ensures that people remain in situ. The reason the government is doing it is because it's a landlord's government. It's made up of landlords and it represents the interests of landlords. The other striking contrast is that between the angel investors, €500,000 for angel investors. These are high net wealth individuals, people who are multi-millionaires who invest, and the government has made up a special tax break costing the public €55 million for them. And you compare that to how children are being treated in this budget. One of the most shameful aspects of this budget is the really, really shameful, disgraceful treatment of children. So the amount you're going to get for a qualifying child, so if you're on a social welfare payment and you have a child, they're increasing your payment per week by €4. I'm beginning to get the beginnings of a sense of how expensive it is to have a child, but I'm only getting the very beginnings because I understand that it becomes a lot more expensive as the child gets older and older, and you have to buy clothes and pay for education and everything else that you have to do. €4 a week in a cost of living crisis. It's just absolutely scandalous. But it's even worse in terms of domiciliary care allowance, where the extra you're getting per week, you're getting an extra tenner a month, $250 a week in a cost of living crisis. And, you know, it's only a couple of months since Leo Varadkar launched a plan to end child poverty. Very ambitious. But it seems to me that this is much more in line with the old Leo Varadkar, the Leo Varadkar who said that Tiny Tim should get a job. It appears that this is now government policy, that the only way that these children can pay for themselves if they go out and get a job. In terms of education, is that the same policy that is informing the idea that we'll extend the school book scheme, but only up to third year? That the Leaving Cert is some sort of luxury for people to do. In education, you have not, we know about the crisis in terms of recruitment and retention of teachers. That's a crisis that is going to get worse, and there's nothing here to address it. No increase in pay for teachers, no accommodation for teachers or other key workers. A paltry sum of $7 million in terms of extra capitation that will go nowhere to getting rid of the supposedly voluntary charges for school, and nothing. No increase despite the promises for postgraduate workers. Richard has made the point of the stark contrast between a one-income family, one earner of 25,000 euros, they get €52 a year in the tax changes. They get €1 a week. And you contrast that with a two-income family of 175,000 euros, they get €992 a week, almost a year, almost 1,000 euros compared to what ordinary workers and low-paid workers get. I want to draw attention to the complete failure of this budget on the question of climate action and the biodiversity crisis. There's a peculiar line. So you set up, you abolish one rainy day fund and then set up two rainy day funds to replace them. And you call one of them the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund, which is going to reach 14 billion, of which only 3 billion is actually anything to do with climate and nature. So it's just it's a word. But it says the aim of this fund, the 3 billion, is to help the achievement of carbon budgets through capital projects where it is clear our climate targets are not being reached. I mean, that reads to me like a blatant admission that we're not going to reach our targets. I mean, we haven't reached any of our targets up till now. We're on the trajectory to wildly miss our targets. And it raises the question, what's that money going to be used for? Is it going to be used to buy carbon credits or to pay fines? Is that the purpose of why we're putting this money away? Because it makes no sense whatsoever to say what we're going to do in terms of climate action is put money away into a fund that will be invested in something. We are in the ecological crisis now. You look around the world, you look at what's happened in Greece, you look at, flooding 1 month coming after horrendous wildfires the previous month. You look at the devastation that is happening across our planet. This is happening right now. It makes sense to invest money right now to address the climate catastrophe, as opposed to putting it away for some day in the future. This crisis is happening right now. So it doesn't make any sense. And instead, what the government has is 29 million euros extra. That's all they have for expanding public transport. And there's no indication that the supposed 2-to-1 ratio of investment in public transport versus investment in roads is being kept. It looks like it's a 50-50 ratio that is contained in the budget documents. What is needed, and it's not rocket science, it's something we've been shouting for a very, very long time, it's contained in our budget documents, is you invest in free, frequent, expanded public transport, you have state investment in renewable energy as opposed to waiting for the private sector to do it. You retrofit people's homes massively through a state construction company, both the installation of solar panels and proper insulation, and you fund farmers, small farmers, guarantee them a decent income to have a just transition. The cost of childcare. I mean, the government made a promise that in this budget they would reduce the cost of childcare by 25%. And the government is going to claim that they're keeping that promise. I mean, but really that's a joke. The government is saying they're going to do it in September 2024. Like, it was kind of a new innovation, and a government a few years back decided that they would announce measures in the budget, but they wouldn't be introduced in January. Instead, they'd come in April, so it's a cheaper cost. But to stretch that all the way to September, that's almost a year from now, and claim you're doing it in this budget is really a joke. There's 10 million contained in terms of extra core funding for childcare. 10 million, that's all. When the pay claim of the childcare workers, very underpaid workers, very crucial group of workers, their pay claim of €2 an hour would cost 142 million euros. So what you're saying to the workers is that you'll continue to work on poverty wages, and you're saying to parents that they will continue to effectively pay a second mortgage in order to have child care for their children. In our budget document, we propose free childcare. We budget for free childcare from next year, and we outline a road to a proper national childcare service provided free at the point of use at no extra cost to ordinary people, paid for through progressive taxation. Question arises, which is that, like, how in one of the richest countries in the world on a GDP per capita basis, while running a massive surplus, how can you have a budget that fails the vast majority of people in this country in such a dramatic and blatant way? And the answer is because the government's budget and the government's policy is based on the capitalist market is going to provide the solution to the problems people face. So we shall incentivize angel investors to come and invest to create solutions for the climate crisis or whatever they're going to invest in. We're going to give tax breaks to landlords to enter the market or to continue in the market to resolve the housing crisis. We're going to give further tax breaks to multinational corporations who already pay very, very little in the way of tax to keep them here. It sees the market as being the solution to the problems we have in our society. That's the root cause of the problem, and it's rooted in the fact that fundamentally the government represents those interests. The problem is, the capitalist market is not the solution. The capitalist market is the problem. The capitalist market is responsible for the housing crisis. The capitalist market is responsible for the ecological disaster we have across our planet. The capitalist market is responsible for the cost of living crisis. We know through multiple studies now that on a global basis, on an EU basis, and on an Irish basis, 2/3 of the reason that we have inflation now, 2/3 of the price increases are caused by profiteering. What we have is greedflation. It's not inflation. And the government refuses to address any of that because they think the market is the solution and because they represent those who are engaged in the profiteering, be they the big oil and gas corporations, the big food supermarkets, the big agribusiness corporations, and so on, all of them making massive profits. And we have to point out the reality that corporate profits, as Richard has referred to, have soared in this country. People wouldn't believe it, that they've quadrupled in the course of the last 10 years. And it's not just corporate profits that have soared. The personal wealth of the richest people in this country has also soared. So that the millionaires in this country, they make up the top 5% of this population, their collective wealth is now 388 billion euros. And so we have to say now is not the time, as Sinn Féin has done, of shelving the proposal for a wealth tax. Now is the time to say that this wealth and resources, which are massive in our society, should be actually taken into the control and the hands of ordinary people and used to address all of the social crises that we have. We do not need a government that manages this capitalist system. We need a left government that implements an eco-socialist budget that transforms things in the interest of ordinary people. Because things don't have to be this way. We don't have to have 1 in 10 families reliant on food banks to get by. We don't have to have a health crisis. We don't have to have a housing crisis. We have enough resources in this country to have a decent life, decent public services for everybody. But what that requires is a mass movement to end the rule of the rich, the tax-avoiding multinational corporations, the big landlords, the big polluting industry, and have a left government that actually serves the interests of ordinary people and implements an eco-socialist budget.
Barry.
Question for Minister McGrath. Where is the vision?